Among the thousands of plantation records preserved in the archives of rural Georgia, one ledger stands apart, a document so disturbing that local historians debated for decades whether to make it public. The entry dated March 1851 describes a female slave whose appearance was considered so horrifying that overseers initially refused to work near her. Yet within 7 years, this same woman would own the entire estate, control its fortune, and bury its master under circumstances that sparked the investigation involving state officials. The official report was sealed for over a century. What happened at Wycliffe Plantation wasn't just about forbidden desire or social transgression. It was about something far more calculated, far more sinister, and far more successful than anyone dared to admit. Before we continue with the story of the woman they called the Abominable One, if you're ready to hear what really happened behind the gates of one of Georgia's most prosperous plantations, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear. Hit that notification bell and leave a comment telling us what state you're watching from. Now, let me take you back to a place where appearances could condemn you, but ambition could save you no matter the cost. The events that would later consume Wycliffe Plantation began not with mystery, but with a transaction so routine it barely warranted notation in the overseer's journal. Wycliffe Plantation stretched across 200 acres of prime cotton land in Hancock County, Georgia, approximately 15 miles southwest of Sparta. By the late 1840s, it had established itself as one of the region's most consistently profitable estates, producing an average of 320 bales per season. The main house, a Greek Revival structure with 6 fluted columns and a wraparound ver, stood at the end of a quarter-mile oak-lined drive that announced the Hafford family's prominence long before visitors reached the front steps. Thaddeus Hafford had inherited the property in 1842 upon his father's death, along with 63 enslaved people and debts that would have destroyed a less determined man. He was 31 years old, recently widowed. His wife, Catherine, having died in childbirth along with their infant son 2 years prior and possessed of a reputation for meticulous record-keeping that bordered on obsession. Every expenditure, every birth, every death, every pound of cotton was documented in leather-bound ledgers that he maintained personally, never delegating the task, even to his most trusted overseer. The plantation's workforce lived in 2 rows of cabins constructed from pine logs and whitewashed once yearly. Each structure housed between 8 and 12 people, with families separated only by thin cotton curtains hung from the ceiling beams. The work bell rang at 4:30 each morning, 6 days a week. Sundays were reserved for rest and the mandatory attendance at services conducted by a circuit preacher who emphasized obedience, patience, and the promise of rewards in the afterlife. Hancock County society in 1849 consisted of approximately 24 planter families, a merchant class clustered in Sparta, and a transient population of overseers, traders, and craftsmen who moved between properties as work demanded. Social hierarchies were rigid, maintained through an intricate system of visiting customs, marriage alliances, and public displays during events like the annual Harvest Ball and the 4th of July barbecue held on the courthouse lawn. Thaddeus Hafford attended these functions dutifully but without enthusiasm, earning a reputation as a man more interested in profit margins than social climbing. His closest neighbor, Robert Crenshaw, owned the adjacent property to the east. 1,100 acres that consistently underperformed Wycliffe despite similar soil quality. The rivalry between them was polite but unmistakable, expressed through competitive bids at slave auctions and pointed remarks about yield per acre during conversations at the Sparta Mercantile. Crenshaw's wife, Louisa, led the informal social hierarchy among plantation mistresses, a role that required no small amount of coordination, given that most estates were separated by miles of unpaved roads that became impassable during heavy rains. The absence of a mistress at Wycliffe was noted, though not openly discussed in Thaddeus's presence. His sister Margaret had offered multiple times to relocate from Savannah to serve as hostess, but he had declined each suggestion with increasing firmness. He employed a housekeeper, a free woman of color named Delapuet, who managed the domestic staff and ensured that meals appeared on time and linens remained crisp despite the humidity that plagued the region from May through September. It was into this carefully ordered world that Sarah arrived in October 1849. The slave coffle reached Wycliffe on a Tuesday afternoon, later than expected due to heavy rains that had swollen the Ocone River and forced a 20-mile detour. Augustus Webb, the trader leading the group, had sent word ahead that he was bringing prime field hands, recently arrived from Virginia. Badius had been in the market for additional workers, since losing 4 men to typhoid fever the previous summer, and Virginia stock generally commanded premium prices due to their reputation for strength and discipline. What arrived was something else entirely. 17 people emerged from the wagons, their clothes stiff with dried mud, and their faces showing the blank exhaustion of those who had walked over 200 m in chains. Webb conducted the inspection in the side yard away from the main house as was customary. Thaddeus moved down the line with his ledger, noting approximate ages, visible health conditions, and any scars or deformities that might affect work capacity. He had learned from his father never to purchase purely on a trader's recommendation. Too many men had been ruined by acquiring workers who proved sickly or rebellious once the sale was finalized. He almost passed by the woman entirely. She stood near the end of the line, her head lowered and her body angled slightly away from the others, as though trying to minimize her presence. She appeared to be in her early 20s, approximately 5'6" and tall, with a sturdy frame that suggested she could handle fieldwork. Her dress, like the others, was filthy from the journey, but there was something about the way she held herself, a rigid control that Thaddeus had learned to recognize as either defiance or terror. "That one's not for sale," Webb said quickly, noticing Thaddeus's attention. "She's damaged goods, just bringing her along because the previous owner wanted her moved." "Damaged how?" Webb shifted his weight, glancing at the other potential buyers who had gathered for the inspection. 2 smaller planters from adjoining counties. "See for yourself if you're curious, but I'm telling you now, she's been nothing but trouble since Richmond. Nobody wants to work next to her, and I can't say I blame them." Thaddeus's interest, previously mild, sharpened. He had not built Wycliffe's profitability by following conventional wisdom or accepting surface explanations. "Show me." Webb walked over and gripped the woman's chin, forcing her head up. She didn't resist, but Thaddeus saw her entire body go rigid. When Webb pulled down the collar of her dress to expose her neck and upper chest, Thaddeus understood immediately why the trader had tried to discourage his interest. Her skin was marked by irregular patches of pale white tissue that stood in stark contrast to her natural dark brown complexion. The patches varied in size from smaller than a coin to larger than a man's hand, spreading across her neck, disappearing beneath her clothing, and reappearing on her forearms and hands. The edges where the discolored skin met the normal pigmentation were sharply defined, creating a mottled pattern that drew the eye precisely because it violated expectations of what human skin should look like. One of the other planters made a sound of disgust and turned away. Webb released the woman and stepped back. "You see, Abominable, the previous owner bought her at 12 years old. Didn't notice the condition until she was older, and it spread. He kept her in the kitchen house mostly, away from the others. They think it's catching, though I've never seen evidence of it. Still, it creates problems, fights, superstitions. I told him I'd transport her west if he paid the cost, but I'm not representing her as merchandise." "What's her name?" Thaddeus asked, still looking at her. "Sarah, no surname that I know of. She reads some, which the previous owner said made her useful for household tasks. Can do figures well enough to keep kitchen inventories." Thaddeus closed his ledger. He had read about this condition in a medical text his father kept in the library. Vitiligo, a disorder that caused the destruction of pigment in patches of skin. It was not contagious, not dangerous, and had no effect whatsoever on a person's ability to work. Yet, he also understood immediately why Webb considered her worthless as merchandise. In a society where appearance and visible markers of race determined every aspect of a person's fate, Sarah's condition made her an anomaly that would inspire fear, disgust, and suspicion wherever she went. "How much for the 3 men in the front and the woman?" he asked. Webb's eyebrows rose. "You serious? I don't make jokes about business transactions, Augustus. Give me a price for all 4. The transaction was completed within 20 minutes. Thaddeus paid $800 for the 3 men who were indeed prime field hands in excellent condition, and $30 for Sarah, barely more than the cost of transporting her from Virginia. Webb seemed almost grateful to be rid of her, though he made a point of warning Thaddeus again about the trouble she might cause among the other slaves. That evening, as Thaddeus updated his ledgers by lamplight, he made a notation that he would later have cause to remember: acquired female, approximately 23 years, literate, marked by skin condition that renders her appearance disturbing to others, but does not impair function. Placed in kitchen house under Delaz's supervision, cost $30. Expected value uncertain. What he could not have known, what no amount of careful record-keeping could have predicted, was that this $30 purchase would alter the fate of Wycliffe Plantation in ways that would eventually require state intervention to unravel. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly, like rot spreading through timber. Sarah's first weeks at Wycliffe passed without incident, though not without notice. De la Puette, the free housekeeper who had managed domestic operations for nearly a decade, assigned Sarah to tasks that kept her away from the main house and, more importantly, away from Thaddeus Havford's direct line of sight. She worked in the kitchen house, a separate structure 20 yards behind the main residence, where meals were prepared by a staff of 4 women who had developed an efficient system that required little supervision. The other kitchen workers initially refused to share sleeping quarters with her. Delaz solved the problem by converting a small storage room attached to the kitchen house into private quarters, 8 FT by 10 FT, barely large enough for a straw mattress and a wooden crate for personal belongings. Sarah accepted the arrangement without comment, just as she accepted the sideways glances and the way conversation stopped when she entered a room. But Delaz, whose position required her to notice details that others missed, observed something that troubled her. Sarah was far more educated than Webb's brief description had suggested. She didn't just read some, she read with the fluency of someone who had received systematic instruction. When Delaz tested her by leaving a newspaper on the kitchen work table, Sarah had it memorized by evening, able to recite commodity prices and political news with perfect accuracy. Her arithmetic was even more impressive. She could calculate conversions, estimate quantities, and maintain inventory records faster than Delaz could verify them. "Where'd you learn all that?" Delaz asked one evening after discovering that Sarah had reorganized the entire spice cupboard using a logical system that actually improved deficiency. "Previous household," Sarah replied, her voice quiet and carefully neutral. "The mistress there taught her daughters. I was allowed to listen. Allowed, or you just listened." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, a suggestion of intelligence deliberately kept hidden. "Does it matter now?" Delaz decided it didn't matter, but she also decided to mention Sarah's abilities to Thaddeus during their weekly review of household accounts. His response surprised her. "Have her start maintaining the kitchen ledgers," he said. "If she's accurate with figures, she might as well make herself useful. The current system is adequate, but there's always room for improvement." This decision, seemingly minor, marked the first step in a progression that would later seem inevitable to some observers and incomprehensible to others. By December, Sarah was managing not just kitchen inventories, but also maintaining records for the smokehouse, the dairy, the vegetable gardens, and the hen house. Her ledgers were meticulous, organized with a precision that actually exceeded Thaddeus's own careful standards. When the annual audit of household expenses revealed that food costs had decreased by nearly 12% without any reduction in quality or quantity, Delaire reported the achievement to Thaddeus with barely concealed amazement. He requested to see the ledgers personally. Sarah delivered them to his study on a gray January afternoon, when rain hammered against the windows and made the whole house feel enclosed, separate from the world beyond. She entered the room with her eyes lowered, placed the books on his desk with hands that showed the white patches extending across her knuckles and fingers, and turned to leave without speaking. "Wait," Thaddeus said, not looking up from the first ledger. "Explain this entry from November 3rd. The calculation doesn't match the previous system." She turned back, still not meeting his eyes directly. "I changed the method for recording partial units. The old system rounded everything to whole numbers, which created cumulative errors. This way is more accurate over time. Show me." What followed was a 15-minute discussion of accounting methodology that revealed several things to Thaddeus. Sarah's education far exceeded anything he had been led to believe. Her mathematical reasoning was sophisticated enough to identify inefficiencies in systems that had been in place for years. And perhaps most significantly, she could explain complex concepts with a clarity that suggested she had spent time thinking about precisely how to make her knowledge valuable to someone who might otherwise her as merely another piece of property to be utilized or discarded. When she finished her explanation, Thaddeus leaned back in his chair and studied her properly for the first time since the day of her arrival. The lamplight threw shadows across her face, making the contrast between the patches of pale and dark skin even more pronounced. In that moment, he understood with perfect clarity why others found her appearance disturbing. It violated an unconscious expectation of human uniformity, creating a visual dissonance that the mind struggled to resolve. But he also saw something else: intelligence deliberately restrained, ambition carefully hidden beneath layers of learned deference, and a will that had somehow survived circumstances that would have broken most people. "Can you read and write as well as you calculate?" he asked. "Yes, sir. How well?" For the first time she met his eyes directly, and he saw in them a flash of something that might have been defiance or desperation, or perhaps both, well enough to write letters that wouldn't embarrass the person signing them. A long silence followed, broken only by the rain and the distant sound of someone chopping wood behind the kitchen house. "Starting next week," Thaddeus said slowly, "you'll spend your mornings in the kitchen as usual. Your afternoons will be spent here assisting me with correspondence and record-keeping. Delaire will adjust your other duties accordingly. You'll continue sleeping in your current quarters. Is this arrangement clear?" "Yes, sir." "Then you're dismissed." She left without another word, but Thaddeus sat at his desk for a long time after she was gone, staring at the ledgers, and wondering if he had just made a brilliant efficiency decision or a catastrophic error in judgment. In the social world he inhabited, the line between the two was often thinner than most people like to admit. News of the arrangement spread through the plantation within days, as news always did in a community where privacy was a luxury reserved for the master's family. The reactions varied by proximity and perspective. The kitchen staff whispered among themselves, but kept their opinions carefully guarded, knowing that Delaire would report any hint of insubordination. The field workers, whose contact with the main house was limited to brief encounters during meal distributions, mostly didn't care. One house slave's duties were much like another's as far as they were concerned. But Robert Crenshaw, who heard about it from his overseer, who had heard it from Wycliffe's overseer during a chance meeting in Sparta, raised the issue with Thaddeus over whiskey at the Sparta Tavern on a cold February evening. "You're inviting talk," Crenshaw said carefully, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Having that particular girl working in your private study, people notice things like that." "People can notice whatever they like," Thaddeus replied, his tone suggesting the conversation was already over. "She's more competent at record-keeping than any clerk I could hire, costs me nothing beyond her normal upkeep, and doesn't gossip about my business in town. I fail to see the problem. The problem is appearances, Thaddeus. You're a widower living alone except for servants. Crenshaw gestured vaguely, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. You know what she is. I know she saved me approximately 15 hours per week of administrative work that I can now dedicate to more profitable activities. If you're concerned about impropriety, Robert, perhaps you should examine why you're imagining it in the first place. The barb landed. Crenshaw's face re-ended, and he changed the subject to cotton prices and the upcoming planting season. But the conversation marked a shift in how others viewed Thaddeus's household arrangements. A shift from curiosity to suspicion, from gossip to judgment. What no one outside Wycliffe could see was the actual nature of the relationship developing between Thaddeus and Sarah during those afternoon work sessions. It was not romantic, at least not initially. It was something more complex and perhaps more dangerous. A meeting of minds that discovered mutual recognition in an environment where such recognition violated every social rule governing their respective existences. They discussed plantation business, certainly crop yields, market conditions, inventory management, staffing decisions. But they also discussed books, having discovered that Sarah had somehow gained access to a far wider range of literature than should have been possible for someone in her circumstances. She had read Shakespeare, Milton, and Plutarch. She had opinions on constitutional law and agricultural economics. She could debate philosophy with a sophistication that suggested years of dedicated study. Thaddeus never asked directly how she had acquired this education, sensing that the answer might implicate people who had taken risks to provide it. Sarah never volunteered the information, maintaining always the careful boundary between what could be acknowledged and what must remain unspoken. By April, she was composing his business correspondence, managing his personal accounts, and organizing his library using a cataloging system of her own design that proved more efficient than the haphazard arrangement he had inherited from his father. The afternoons in the study stretched longer, sometimes extending past dinner, requiring Della to bring meals on trays that Sarah and Thaddeus ate while continuing their discussions of crop rotation patterns or the implications of new tariff legislation. It was during one of these extended sessions on an unseasonably warm evening in late May that the dynamic between them crossed a threshold that neither had consciously intended to approach. Thaddeus had been reviewing a letter from his sister Margaret, who had written yet again to inquire whether he intended to remarry and whether she might suggest some suitable candidates from Savannah society. He made a sound of frustration and tossed the letter aside. "Problem?" Sarah asked, not looking up from the ledger she was updating. "My sister believes my life is incomplete without a wife to manage my household and provide heirs to inherit this property." "And what do you believe?" The question was bold, crossing the invisible line that usually prevented servants from inquiring about their master's personal thoughts. Thaddeus should have reprimanded her for the presumption. Instead, he found himself answering honestly, "I believe marriage in our society is a commercial transaction dressed up with religious ceremony and social obligation. My first marriage was arranged by my father to consolidate land holdings and political alliances. Catherine was a kind woman who deserved better than what she received from that arrangement. I have no interest in repeating the experience." Sarah's hands stilled on the ledger. "But you'll need heirs eventually. Someone to pass Wycliffe to, perhaps. Or perhaps I'll follow my father's example and work myself to death, leaving everything to a son who never wanted it in the first place." He paused, then added more quietly, "Do you ever think about what you would do if circumstances were different? If you had choices?" She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw in her expression something raw and honest that she usually kept carefully hidden every single day. "But thinking about impossible things doesn't change reality, Mr. Haverford. It just makes the actual circumstances harder to bear." "What if circumstances could change?" he asked, the words escaping before he fully considered their implications. "What if they weren't as fixed as everyone assumes?" The silence that followed felt weighted, dangerous. Sarah's eyes searched his face, trying to determine whether this was a hypothetical philosophical discussion or something more concrete and treacherous. Then someone would have to be willing to violate every rule that makes their society function. She said finally they would have to be prepared to lose everything they've built, every relationship they value, every assumption about who they are and what their life means. Most people aren't capable of that kind of courage or that kind of selfishness. I'm not sure which it would actually be. Thaddeus didn't respond immediately. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the plantation grounds where the last light was fading from the sky. Somewhere in the distance, someone was singing one of the work songs that drifted up from the quarters in the evening, full of coded meanings and careful hope. What if someone was prepared for those consequences? He asked quietly, still looking out the window. What if they decided that the rules everyone else follows are built on foundations too rotten to sustain, and that the only honest choice is to stop pretending otherwise? Sarah rose from her chair, the ledger forgotten. She walked to where he stood, stopping just outside the range, where their proximity would become something that couldn't be explained as merely professional. When she spoke, her voice was steady but carried an undertone of warning. Then that person would need to understand that they're not just risking their own destruction. They're risking the destruction of everyone around them. And they'd need to be very, very certain that what they're reaching for is worth that cost. He turned to face her, and in the failing light, the patches on her skin seemed less like marks of disfigurement, and more like a map of territory no one else had thought to explore. "What if it is?" he asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she picked up the ledger, restored it to its proper place on the shelf, and left the study without another word. But they both knew that something fundamental had shifted, that a possibility had been named that could never be completely unspoken again. The consequences of that conversation would take months to fully materialize, unfolding with the slow inevitability of summer heat building toward a storm that everyone can sense coming, but no one quite knows how to prevent. The summer of 1850 brought drought to Hancock County, the kind of prolonged dry spell that tested even the most experienced planter's skill at maintaining viable crops. The cotton suffered, leaves curling inward and bolls developing poorly, while water levels in the wells dropped low enough to require rationing. Tempers frayed under the relentless heat, and the usual summer illnesses, dysentery, fever, exhaustion struck with particular severity, responded to the crisis with characteristic methodical planning, implementing a modified irrigation system that diverted water from the creek at the property's northern boundary and adjusting work schedules to spare field hands the worst of the midday sun. But the stress of the season took its toll. By August, he had lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, developed a persistent cough that kept him awake nights, and grew increasingly irritable with overseers who failed to implement his instructions with sufficient precision. Sarah, working now almost exclusively in the study rather than the kitchen, took on more of his administrative burden without being explicitly asked to do so. She drafted responses to creditors who were pressing for payment on loans taken out during better years. She reorganized crop rotation plans to maximize what could be salvaged from the current season while preparing for recovery in the next. She even began attending meetings with overseers, standing silently in the corner while Thaddeus discussed strategy, then later providing observations about inefficiencies or inconsistencies she had noticed in the reports. The overseers tolerated her presence with varying degrees of comfort. Some, like James Hawthorne, who had worked at Wycliffe since Thaddeus's father's time, treated her with the careful courtesy one might extend to an exotic animal that seemed tame but might prove dangerous if mishandled. Others, particularly a younger man named Daniel Tucker, who had been hired the previous spring, made their resentment clear through tight-lipped silences and references to that creature when they thought Thaddeus wasn't listening. It was Tucker who first brought his concerns directly to Thaddeus in early September, requesting a private meeting in the study to discuss what he called irregularities in the household management. Thaddeus received him with cold formality, gesturing to a chair, but not offering the whiskey that usually accompanied such conversations. "Speak plainly, Daniel. I have work to complete before evening." Tucker shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, but determined to proceed. "Mr. Haverford, there's talk among the men, among the field hands in town when I go for supplies. It's about the girl, about how much time she spends here, about how you've changed since she started working for you. Some are saying," he trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the accusation. "Some are saying what exactly?" Thaddeus's voice was dangerously quiet. "That you've taken her as—" Tucker gestured helplessly, as more than just a clerk. "That you're keeping her for purposes that ain't proper. That you're letting her influence decisions about the plantation that she's got no business influencing." "I see. And what do you believe, Daniel?" "I believe a man's business is his own, sir. But I also believe that when that business starts affecting the order of things, when field hands start questioning why they should take orders when the master's listening to a girl who looks like something out of a nightmare, then it becomes everybody's problem." That stood slowly, walked to the window, and looked out at the plantation grounds for a long moment before responding. "Let me be very clear about something, Daniel. Sarah maintains my records because she is more competent at that task than anyone else I could reasonably employ. She participates in planning discussions because her observations have proven consistently valuable. If you or anyone else finds those facts troubling, I suggest you examine your own assumptions about competence and value rather than questioning my judgment." "But, sir," she's finished that sentence carefully. Thaddeus interrupted, his tone cutting. "Whatever you were about to say will determine whether you continue working at Wycliffe or find yourself looking for employment elsewhere by week's end." Tucker's face re-ended, but he managed to swallow whatever words had been forming. "I meant no disrespect, Mr. Haverford. I'm just concerned about how things look to outsiders." "Then let me relieve you of that concern. How things look to outsiders ceased being my primary consideration some time ago. What matters is whether this plantation remains profitable despite drought, despite market fluctuations, despite every other challenge that would have destroyed lesser operations. If maintaining that profitability requires unconventional approaches to labor management, then I suggest everyone involved either adapts or seeks employment on more conventionally managed estates. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir. Good. You're dismissed." After Tucker left, Thaddeus remained at the window, watching the sunset over fields that should have been white with ready harvest cotton, but instead showed the brown of drought-stressed plants struggling to survive. He heard the study door open behind him, and didn't need to turn to know it was Sarah arriving as always, precisely at the time they had established for their afternoon work session. "You heard that conversation," he said, not making it a question. "The window was open. I was in the kitchen." "Yes, I heard. Does it concern you what people are saying?" She moved to the desk and began arranging the documents they would need to review. "What concerns me is whether what people are saying will make life more difficult than it already is. What they think of me stopped mattering a long time ago, Mr. Haverford. I learned to stop caring about that when I was 12 years old and realized my appearance would never change, that I would always be something people stared at or turned away from." He finally turned to face her. "And what about what I think of you? Does that matter?" The question hung in the air between them, impossible to answer without acknowledging realities that neither had yet spoken aloud. Sarah's hand stilled on the documents. "I think you already know the answer to that," she said quietly. "Just as I think you know that Tucker's concerns aren't entirely groundless. We've been careful, but we haven't been careful enough. People notice patterns. They notice changes. They notice when a man who used to eat dinner alone starts requesting 2 plates. They notice when private meetings extend past dark. They notice everything, Mr. Haverford, because noticing things and talking about them is how people without power try to exercise control over their world. So what would you suggest? That we stop working together, that I fire you, or send you to field work to satisfy gossips and fools? I would suggest you think very carefully about what you actually want from this arrangement, and whether you're prepared to accept the consequences of getting it." The conversation might have continued, might have finally forced into open acknowledgement things that had been developing between them for months, but it was interrupted by urgent knocking on the study door. James Hawthorne entered without waiting for permission, his face showing the kind of alarm that meant genuine emergency rather than routine concern. "Mr. H. Ford, you need to come to the East Field immediately." One of the hands collapsed, and it looks like the fever. 3 others are showing symptoms. The drought had weakened everyone's resistance, making them vulnerable to illnesses that would normally be manageable. What began with 4 cases in the East Field spread within 2 weeks to encompass nearly a third of Plantation's workforce. The fever struck without pattern or mercy. Young and old, strong and weak, field hands and house servants. 2 died within the first week, their bodies burning with temperatures that no amount of cool water could reduce. 5 more followed before the end of the month. Thaddeus threw himself into managing the crisis with the same methodical intensity he applied to all problems, converting one of the storage barns into a makeshift infirmary, bringing in a doctor from Sparta who prescribed treatments that helped some patients and failed others with no discernible logic. He personally supervised the distribution of quinine, the isolation of symptomatic individuals, and the cleaning protocols meant to prevent further spread. Sarah worked beside him throughout, abandoning the study entirely to help manage the infirmary. She kept meticulous records of symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. She organized the healthy workers into rotating nursing shifts. She even assisted the doctor directly, showing no fear of contagion and a steady competence that earned grudging respect from those who had previously treated her with contempt or avoidance. It was during this period, when normal social boundaries dissolved under the pressure of shared crisis, that people began to see Sarah differently. The patches on her skin that had seemed so disturbing in ordinary circumstances became merely incidental when she was helping to save lives. Her intelligence, previously regarded as suspicious or unnatural, became invaluable when she could predict disease progression and organize resources with efficiency that prevented deaths. By the time the fever finally burned itself out in late October, 12 people had died, but many more had been saved who might have succumbed under less competent management. Thaddeus himself had fallen ill during the final week of the outbreak, a development that terrified the entire plantation because succession plans were unclear, and a prolonged absence of master's authority could trigger chaos that might destroy everything. Sarah nursed him personally, sleeping on the floor of his bedroom to monitor his condition through fever dreams and dangerous spikes in temperature that came close to killing him. She was there when he woke on the 4th day. Weak but lucid, the fever finally broken. "How many?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. 12 dead, 37 recovered, 7 still showing symptoms but stable. You were unconscious for 3 days. He tried to sit up, failed, and settled for turning his head to look at her properly. She was sitting in a chair beside the bed, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who had not slept properly in weeks. The morning light coming through the window illuminated her features, making the patches of discolored skin seem less like marks of disease and more like something painted by an artist who had decided that conventional beauty was less interesting than striking contrast. "You could have died taking care of me," he said. "The fever was contagious. You risked yourself unnecessarily. No more than you did. No more than anyone who helped during the outbreak. That's not the same thing they don't have." He stopped, unable to finish the thought without saying things that couldn't be unsaid. "Don't have what?" she asked, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "Don't have anything to lose. Don't have any reason to care whether you lived or died. Is that what you were going to say?" "I was going to say they don't have your condition. They were risking fever. You were risking fever while already bearing marks that make people fear you might be carrying something worse. And yet here I am, still healthy, still whole, almost as if the marks on my skin have nothing to do with illness at all. Just like you told me months ago when you explained what vitiligo actually is." He closed his eyes briefly, exhaustion pulling at him despite the mental clarity returning. "Thank you for staying, for helping," for he gestured vaguely at the room, the plantation beyond, everything that her presence had prevented from falling into disorder. "You're welcome," she said simply. Then after a pause, "Mr. Hafford, when you're recovered, we need to discuss something important. Something that can't be avoided any longer." "What is it?" "Not now. You need rest, but soon, I promise you that." She left before he could press for more information, and Thaddeus fell back into sleep, wondering what new complication was about to emerge from a situation that already felt impossibly tangled. The answer came 2 weeks later on a cool November afternoon, when Thaddeus had finally recovered enough to return to his study and resume normal operations. Sarah entered carrying the household ledgers but set them aside without opening them. "I'm pregnant," she said without preamble. "Approximately 2 months along based on my calculations. I wanted to be certain before telling you." The room seemed to contract around those words. Every comfortable assumption about how their relationship would proceed suddenly revealed as hopelessly naive. Thaddeus sat down heavily in his chair, his mind racing through implications that branched in a dozen impossible directions. "How did this happen?" he asked, then immediately recognized the stupidity of the question. "I mean, when during the fever outbreak, you don't remember. You were delirious with fever, and I was sleeping in your room to monitor your condition. One night, you woke partially confused about where you were and who I was. You thought I was your wife. Catherine, I should have left, should have called for help, but I didn't. I told myself you were too sick to know what you were doing, that it would be kinder to let you believe the delusion than to distress you by contradicting it. But that was a lie. The truth is I wanted it to happen." She delivered this explanation with the same calm precision she used for reporting financial figures. But Thaddeus could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the edge of the desk. "Sarah, he stopped, realizing he had no idea how to complete that sentence. Apology seemed inadequate. Denial was impossible. Reassurance would be meaningless without some concrete plan for addressing an impossible situation. "I understand this creates problems," she continued, still in that eerily calm voice. "Problems that have no good solutions in the world we live in. A child of mixed parentage born to an enslaved woman legally belongs to the mother's owner and bears the mother's status. Under law, your child would be your property, which is itself an obscenity too fundamental to bear thinking about directly. There must be options," Thaddeus said, his legal training asserting itself despite shock. "Manumission. I could free you before the birth, establish a separate household, provide financial support, and create a scandal that would destroy your reputation, tank the plantation's value, and make you a social outcast in the only community you've ever known, all while marking our child as illegitimate and ensuring they would face rejection from both white and black society for their entire lives." She shook her head. "Those aren't real solutions, Mr. Haverford. They're just different flavors of disaster." "Then what do you suggest? Because I won't." He stood abruptly, agitation breaking through his usual control. "I won't treat this child as property. I won't treat you as property. I don't care what the law says. What the law says determines every aspect of our reality, whether you care about it or not. But there might be another option. One that's illegal and dangerous and might not work, but at least has the virtue of being honest about what it is. Tell me." She took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of a decision already made, of a course plotted through impossible terrain with full knowledge of how badly it might end. "You marry me. Legally, with a certificate and witnesses, and everything required to make it binding under state law." The silence that followed felt absolute. Thaddeus stared at her, trying to process whether she was serious or whether pregnancy had somehow affected her judgment. "That's impossible," he said finally. "Marriage between it's prohibited by law. Any official who tried to perform the ceremony would face criminal charges. Any witnesses would be accessories. The marriage itself would be void." "Prohibited by law in Georgia," she agreed, "but not everywhere. There are states where such marriages, while socially condemned, aren't explicitly criminal. Pennsylvania, for instance, or Massachusetts. We could travel there, establish temporary residence, marry under those states' laws, and return as husband and wife. The marriage would be legally questionable, but not automatically void, and Georgia would be forced to recognize it under the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution." "You've researched this." "It wasn't a question. I've researched many things during our months working together, including legal precedents for interracial marriage, state by state variations in marriage law, and constitutional requirements for interstate recognition of legal contracts. It's not a guaranteed solution. It could fail in a dozen ways, but it's a real option, not just a fantasy about making the best of an untenable situation." Thaddeus walked to the window, his mind churning through the implications. What she was proposing wasn't just scandalous, it was revolutionary, a direct challenge to the fundamental social order that governed every aspect of life in the antebellum South. If discovered, it could lead to legal challenges, social ostracism, even violence. The plantation would be effectively worthless. His family would disown him, and their child would be raised in a world that had no category for what it represented. And yet, he turned back to face her, seeing not just Sarah, but everything she represented. Intelligence suppressed, humanity denied, potential wasted because of arbitrary rules about skin color and legal status. He thought about his first marriage arranged for property and politics devoid of genuine connection. He thought about the months of working beside Sarah, gradually recognizing in her someone whose mind matched and challenged his own. He thought about the child growing inside her, his child, and the absolute moral obscenity of claiming ownership over his own offspring. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we can never go back. Even if we wanted to, even if it proves too difficult to sustain, we would have crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. I know we would lose almost everything. Social position, economic security, family connections, community acceptance. We would be starting over with nothing except what we could carry with us. I've been starting over with nothing my entire life, Mr. Hafford. The difference is that this time I would be choosing it voluntarily with someone." She stopped, seeming to reconsider her words, "with someone who sees me as human rather than as property or as something abominable to be hidden away." He crossed the room to stand before her, close enough that he could see the fine details of where her discolored skin metal pigmentation, creating patterns that were indeed striking rather than repulsive. "Once you stopped expecting uniformity and started seeing complexity, then we'll do it," he said. "I'll arrange travel to Pennsylvania under pretense of business. We'll marry there legally, return here, and announce the marriage as an accomplished fact. There will be consequences, terrible consequences, but there'll be consequences of choosing honesty over hypocrisy, which seems to me like a trade worth making, even if the cost is everything I've built here." For the first time since entering the study, Sarah's composure cracked slightly. Her eyes glistened with tears. She refused to let fall. "You understand this means you're choosing me over Wycliffe, over your sister, over your entire previous life. I'm choosing my child, and yes, I'm choosing you, not because of the child, though that's part of it. Because in a world full of people who perform the roles society assigns them without questioning whether those roles have any moral foundation, you've consistently demonstrated the courage to be exactly who you are, despite every incentive to hide or diminish yourself. That seems to me like something worth preserving, even at considerable personal cost." They left for Pennsylvania in late November, telling overseers and house staff that Thaddeus was traveling north to investigate new agricultural equipment, and that Sarah was accompanying him to manage correspondence during the journey. Delapuet, who suspected the truth, but was wise enough not to ask directly, packed Sarah's few belongings without comment and made arrangements to manage the household during their absence. The journey took nearly 2 weeks through roads made treacherous by early winter weather. They traveled in Thaddeus's private coach, maintaining separate sleeping arrangements at inns along the route to avoid attracting attention before reaching their destination. The closer they got to Pennsylvania, the more surreal the entire undertaking seemed. Two people from utterly different worlds, legally and socially separated by gulfs that society insisted were unbridgeable, about to formalize a connection that would mark them both as outcasts from the only communities they had ever known. They married on December 12, 1850, in a small Quaker meeting house outside Philadelphia, with 2 witnesses provided by the presiding officiant, who asked no questions beyond those required by law. Sarah wore a simple blue dress purchased in the city. Thaddeus wore his traveling clothes, neither wanting to invest in ceremony that would carry far more weight for its legal and social implications than for any romantic significance. The certificate of marriage was properly executed, witnessed, and recorded with the county clerk. Under Pennsylvania law, the marriage was legal and binding. Under Georgia law, it would be treated as either void or criminal, depending on who was making the interpretation and what their objectives were in doing so. They consummated the marriage that night in a Philadelphia hotel, the first time they had been intimate, while both conscious and willing. It was tender and awkward and utterly transformative, marking the transition from a relationship based on power differentials and impossible circumstances to something approaching genuine partnership. They returned to Georgia in early January 1851, arriving at Wycliffe on a gray afternoon when rain turned the roads to mud and made the whole world seem uncertain and shifting. News of their marriage had preceded them. Impossible to prevent when the certificate had to be filed publicly, and when travelers carried news faster than letters could travel. The consequences began immediately. The first indication that their return would be anything but smooth came before they even reached the main house. As the coach rolled up the Oakline Drive, Thaddeus noticed something wrong with the quality of silence that greeted them. The usual sounds of a working plantation, voices calling instructions, the rhythm of tools, the general ambient noise of daily operations were absent. Instead, the place felt suspended, waiting. James Hawthorne met them at the front steps, his face grave. "Mr. Havford, we need to speak privately immediately. Whatever you need to say can be said in front of my wife," Thaddeus replied, using the word deliberately. Watching Hawthorne's reaction, the overseer's eyes flicked to Sarah, then away, his discomfort palpable. "Sir, there's been development during your absence. Mr. Crenshaw has filed a legal challenge to your ownership of Wycliffe. He claims you violated the moral standards required of plantation owners, and that the property should be seized and auctioned to satisfy debts. He has the support of several other landowners and at least 2 county officials. On what grounds?" Thaddeus kept his voice level, though fury was building beneath the surface. "On the grounds that you've entered into an illegal marriage with a woman of African descent, that this represents mental incapacity or moral depravity, and that you're therefore unfit to manage property or make binding legal decisions. The petition also suggests that the woman," he glanced at Sarah again, "used undue influence or possibly witchcraft to manipulate your judgment." Witchcraft? Thaddeus repeated the word bitter in his mouth. How medieval of them. They're also claiming that her condition, the marks on her skin, is evidence of disease that poses a public health risk. There's a warrant for her detention and medical examination by a state-appointed physician. Sarah, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "They're going to try to have me declared insane or diseased, which would void the marriage and allow them to dispose of me without directly acknowledging that what they really object to is the racial component. It's actually a clever strategy. It's not going to work," Thaddeus said flatly. "The marriage was legal in Pennsylvania and under interstate commerce clause." Mr. Havford, Hawthorne interrupted. "There's something else. During your absence, someone set fire to the East Cotton barn. We managed to contain it before it spread, but we lost approximately 40 bales. There's also been incidents, vandalism, threats. One of the field hands was beaten badly enough to require medical care. No one's admitting who did it, but the message is clear. There are people who want you to fail, who want this plantation to collapse. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror at Wycliffe intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The next 3 months became a siege in all but name. Robert Crenshaw's legal challenge proceeded through county courts with agonizing slowness, each hearing requiring Thaddeus's presence and draining resources he couldn't afford to waste. The lawyers he hired, the few willing to take such a controversial case, cost more than he had anticipated, and several abandoned the case entirely when social pressure from other clients became too intense. The plantation itself suffered from systematic sabotage that was impossible to prove, but obvious to anyone paying attention. Tools disappeared. Fences were damaged. On 2 occasions, poisoned grain was mixed into feed for work animals, killing 3 mules before the contamination was discovered. Field hands reported being accosted in town by groups of white men who warned them that working at Wycliffe would have consequences for their families. Sarah, meanwhile, endured scrutiny that went beyond mere gossip. The state-appointed physician who examined her spent 3 hours conducting tests designed to determine whether her skin condition was contagious. recording measurements, and taking skin samples that he promised would be analyzed by medical experts in Savannah. His report, when finally issued in March, concluded that while her condition was abnormal and disturbing to witness, it posed no direct health risk to others, though he added an editorial comment suggesting that her moral character remained questionable and that her presence in a position of household authority was contrary to natural law and social order. The pregnancy became visible in February, adding fuel to accusations that Sarah had used sexual manipulation to trap Thaddeus into the marriage. Louisa Crenshaw, who had previously maintained cordial, if distant relations with Thaddeus, now cut him completely, refusing to acknowledge his presence at church services and organizing other plantation wives to do the same. But amid the hostility, something unexpected emerged, a small nucleus of support from unlikely sources. Della Hewitt, the free housekeeper, publicly defended Sarah's character and competence, telling anyone who would listen that Wycliffe had never run more efficiently than during Sarah's management. 3 of the field hands, men who had recovered from fever under Sarah's care during the outbreak, made a point of working harder and more efficiently than ever before, their productivity a silent rebuke to claims that the plantation was falling into disorder. Most surprisingly, Thaddeus's sister Margaret made the journey from Savannah in late March, arriving unannounced and requesting a private meeting with both Thaddeus and Sarah. "I came to see if you've completely lost your mind," she said without preamble, accepting tea in the study where so much of this impossible situation had originated, and to determine whether I should be arranging for medical intervention, or simply accepting that my brother has made a deliberate choice that I personally find incomprehensible. "Which have you concluded?" Thaddeus asked dryly. "That you're sane, which somehow makes this more disturbing than if you were simply delusional." Margaret turned to Sarah, studying her with frank curiosity rather than the revulsion or pity that others showed. "My brother has risked everything, wealth, reputation, social position, family connection for you. I'm trying to understand why." Sarah met her gaze steadily. "Perhaps you should ask him rather than me. I'm asking you what makes you worth the destruction of everything he's built." "Nothing," Sarah replied quietly. "I'm not worth what he's losing. No, what could be, but he's not doing this because I'm worth it. He's doing it because he decided that the system that made this choice necessary isn't worth preserving, that participating in that system required compromises he was no longer willing to make." Margaret considered this answer for a long moment. "You love him. That's not relevant to whether he made the right choice. It's relevant to whether you'll make this disaster worth surviving, because I assure you the disaster is coming. Robert Crenshaw has the support of most of the county, and the legal precedents favor his interpretation of marriage law. You'll likely lose Wycliffe within the year. When that happens, what exactly do you plan to do? Where will you go? How will you support yourselves and a child?" Thaddeus started to answer, but Margaret held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not asking rhetorically. I have a proposal, an actual, concrete plan that might salvage something from this catastrophe you've created." She reached into her bag and withdrew a folder of documents. "I have contacts in Philadelphia through my husband's business connections. There's a community of abolitionists and Quakers there who, while they would still find your marriage socially challenging, wouldn't actively work to destroy you. I can arrange temporary housing, introduce you to people who might offer employment despite the scandal, and provide initial financial support while you establish yourselves." "You would do that?" Thaddeus asked, unable to hide his surprise. "Even though you think I've made a terrible mistake, I think you've made a choice that has terrible consequences, which isn't quite the same thing. And you're still my brother, even if you're now a brother I don't entirely recognize. Besides," she glanced at Sarah's visible pregnancy, "I'm about to become an aunt. That child deserves better than to be born into a community that will treat it as an abomination." The offer hung in the air, representing a possible escape route from a situation that seemed increasingly untenable. But before Thaddeus could respond, Sarah spoke. "We appreciate the offer, Mrs. Waverly, but we're not leaving. Not yet. Not until we've exhausted every legal option to keep Wycliffe, and not until the choice to leave is genuinely ours rather than something forced on us by people who want to punish us for violating their expectations." Margaret's eyebrows rose. "That's remarkably stubborn. That's remarkably human," Sarah corrected. which is something people keep forgetting I'm allowed to be. The legal hearing that would determine Wycliffe's fate was scheduled for May 15, 1851 in the Hancock County Courthouse. Thaddeus spent weeks preparing his defense, marshaling every legal precedent about interstate marriage recognition, property rights, and the limits of community moral judgment. His lawyer, a man named Josiah Petton, Thaddeus had to search 3 counties before finding an attorney willing to take the case, warned him repeatedly that the odds were stacked against them. The law is on your side, Petton explained during one of their final preparation sessions, but the law is interpreted by men who have already decided you're wrong. Their prejudices will shape their reading of precedent, and there's very little I can do to prevent that. Then what do you suggest? Win in the court of public opinion before we ever enter the courtroom. Make them see your wife as human rather than as a legal abstraction. Make them see your marriage as something real and valuable rather than as a violation of natural order. It's the only way to create enough doubt that they can't simply rule against you with clear conscience. Thaddeus and Sarah spent hours discussing how to accomplish this seemingly impossible task. The solution they developed was risky, potentially dangerous, and depended on Sarah's willingness to expose herself to public scrutiny in ways that would be profoundly uncomfortable. On May 10th, 5 days before the hearing, Thaddeus published a notice in the Sparta Gazette inviting all citizens of good conscience who wished to understand the true nature of recent events at Wycliffe Plantation to attend an open forum at the courthouse on May 14th. The notice promised full transparency regarding matters of marriage, property, and human dignity, and explicitly invited Robert Crenshaw and other petitioners to attend and ask questions directly. The courthouse was packed when they arrived. Every seat was filled with additional people standing in the aisles and crowding the doorways. The mood was hostile but curious. People had come expecting either spectacle or scandal, and they were prepared to judge what they witnessed accordingly. Thaddeus spoke first, outlining the basic facts of his marriage to Sarah, the legal basis for its validity, and the constitutional principles requiring interstate recognition of legally contracted marriages. He spoke for 20 minutes, his legal training evident in the careful construction of his arguments. Then Sarah stood to speak. The room fell silent. Many had never heard her voice before, knew her only as a figure of rumor and speculation. She stood at the front of the courthouse, her pregnancy visible beneath her simple dress, the patches of pale skin on her face, and hands clearly visible in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. "My name is Sarah Hafford," she began, her voice steady and clear, not Sarah the slave, not Sarah the abomination, but Sarah Hafford, legally married to Thaddeus Hafford under Pennsylvania law and entitled to all the rights and protections that status confers. I know many of you find that claim disturbing or impossible. I know you look at me and see something that violates your assumptions about how the world should work. But I'm asking you to look past your assumptions for a few minutes and see something else. A human being who has done nothing except survive circumstances they never chose and try to build something approaching a decent life with whatever tools were available. She paused, letting the silence stretch, then continued with increasing intensity. I was born with a condition called vitiligo that destroys the pigment in patches of skin. It isn't contagious. It isn't evidence of disease or divine displeasure. It's simply a fact of my existence, like having brown eyes or being right-handed. But that condition meant I was considered unmarketable as merchandise, something to be hidden away or sold cheaply because my appearance made people uncomfortable. For 23 years, I accepted that assessment. I believed that being considered abominable was simply my fate, something to be endured rather than challenged. Then I came to Wycliffe and something changed. Not immediately, not because of romance or manipulation or witchcraft, despite what some have suggested. What changed was that someone finally treated me as though my mind mattered more than my appearance, as though my capabilities were more significant than my circumstances. Mr. Hafford hired me to keep records because I was good at mathematics. He consulted me on plantation management because my observations were accurate. He married me because we discovered that we valued each other's company and judgment above what society told us we were supposed to want. Some of you think that's a lie. You think I must have used sexual manipulation or cunning to trap him. Ask yourselves why that's your immediate assumption. Is it because you genuinely believe I'm capable of that level of deception? Or is it because accepting that he might genuinely value me requires you to reconsider every assumption you hold about who deserves respect and consideration in this society? The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several people looked away, unwilling to meet her direct gaze, but others leaned forward, listening with visible attention. The child I'm carrying is Mr. Haverford's son or daughter. That child will be born free, not because of legal technicalities or clever manipulation of marriage law, but because both parents are determined that no child of theirs will ever know what it means to be owned by another human being. If you take Wycliffe from us, if you void our marriage, if you succeed in punishing us for violating your social rules, you won't be upholding civilization or protecting natural order. You'll simply be proving that system you've built is too fragile to survive even one example of two people choosing each other despite every incentive to do otherwise. She sat down. The silence that followed felt heavy, charged with emotions too complex for easy categorization. Then from somewhere in the back of the room, someone began to clap. Just one person, then another, then several more. Not a majority, not even close to consensus, but enough to suggest that at least some people had heard her words and been moved by them. Robert Crenshaw stood abruptly. This is exactly the kind of eloquent manipulation I've been warning about. She's educated beyond what's natural for someone of her station, taught to speak in ways that sound reasonable, but serve only to undermine the foundations of civilized society. The fact that some of you are applauding proves how dangerous these ideas are. What's dangerous? Thaddeus responded, rising to face his neighbor, is a system that requires treating human beings as property to function. What's dangerous is a society so invested in maintaining hierarchies based on appearance and circumstance that it can't tolerate even one example of those hierarchies being questioned. You want to take Wycliffe from me, not because I've failed to maintain it profitably. The records prove I've increased its value significantly. You want to take it because seeing my marriage forces you to confront the possibility that everything you've built your life around might be morally bankrupt. How dare you? Crenshaw started, but Thaddeus cut him off. How dare I question the righteousness of slavery? How dare I suggest that a person's value might not be determined by skin color or social position? How dare I choose my own wife rather than accepting whatever arrangement serves my neighbor's commercial interests? Those are the questions you're really asking, Robert. And the answer is that I dare because the alternative, continuing to participate in a system I've come to recognize as fundamentally evil, became impossible once I understood what it actually required. The forum dissolved into argument after that, with supporters and opponents shouting over each other until the county sheriff threatened to clear the courthouse if order wasn't restored. But something had shifted. The narrative was no longer simply about whether Thaddeus's marriage was legal. It was about what kind of society people